So chapter 4, how do cells in our body make energy in the form of ATP? So the main learning outcomes for this lecture is to understand what metabolism is. So there's different types of chemical reactions that happen in our body. Some are called endergonic, some are exergonic. So we'll understand what they are. And in order for metabolism to happen in our body, to maintain homeostasis, we need enzymes. They are like the workhorses in a cell. So we'll study briefly as to how enzymes work. We'll talk about the structure and function of ATP. And ATP is made by a process of cellular respiration in our cell. So we'll go over the steps of cellular respiration in this lecture. So this picture is actually showing all the chemical reactions that's been discovered in our body. There's like more than 2,000 chemical reactions happening in every cell of your body in high accuracy. So this is called metabolism. When people talk about metabolism, it means all the chemical reactions. And the chemical reaction we are going to study today is like found like right in the center. It's like a central highway, and all other reactions will kind of feed into it. It's called cellular respiration. So metabolism refers to all the chemical reactions that's happening in your body to maintain homeostasis. So there are two main types of pathways. One is called anabolic pathway. So in anabolic pathways, you have to add energy to the system in order to synthesize a large molecule. For example, the food that you eat will be broken down into smaller pieces. And then what your body will do is it will weave it back together to make the proteins it requires. So it is requiring energy to make a large molecule. The opposite of it is called catabolism. So this is when we generate energy by breaking a large molecule. So your large molecule will be broken down into smaller molecules to produce energy. That is called catabolic. Human beings are heterotrophs. In other words, we can't make our own energy. So we either have to eat a plant or an animal that can to survive. So we are heterotrophs, whereas plants can make their own energy. So they are called autotrophs. So both anabolic pathways and catabolic pathways are happening in the cell right now in order to maintain homeostasis. Sometimes it's going to break it down, and sometimes it's going to build it up. So how does energy flow in the ecosystem? So the main source of energy for all of life forms on Earth is the sun. So energy is flowing from the sun to producers. So these are the plants that have chlorophyll, and they're able to harvest the solar energy and convert it into organic energy. So we will consume it in order to stay alive. So the energy is the main form of energy in the ecosystem is through the sun. So the plants, because they can make their own energy, they are called producers. And because we human beings either eat the plant, right, or the animal that ate the plant, we are called consumers. See, carnivores like us will eat the herbivores. And then there's also decomposers in the ecosystem. So what they'll do is they will break down the organic products, and they will play a huge role in recycling. They are called decomposers. So this flow of energy from the sun to the producer, to the consumer, to the decomposer, and energy leaves your body as heat. So this whole thing is called bioenergetics. So energy is always flowing in the ecosystem. There's a little bit of physics going on here. So this is called as energy transformations that happen in the ecosystem. And they follow the first two laws of thermodynamics. So the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to the other. It can only be transferred. So in other words, energy is highly conserved in the environment. The second law says that the total entropy, that means randomness, in a system can never decrease. So that is the second law of thermodynamics. So for every chemical reaction to happen, it can either be spontaneous or non-spontaneous, depending on the phenomena of Gibbs free energy. So Gibbs free energy of a system is the amount of usable energy in a system. So the food that we consume will provide all the energy for all the chemical reactions that are happening in our cell. And then there's two types of energy. There is potential energy and kinetic energy. So just if you take just water, the energy of an inert system, it's called potential energy. But when it's moving, the energy associated with movement is called kinetic energy. So depending on the Gibbs free energy being either negative or positive, the reaction can either be exergonic or endogonic. In a exa means out. Exergonic reaction, energy will be released into the system. So the bonds actually that are formed in the product are stronger than the bonds that are being broken in a reaction. So that's why it is energy is released, exergonic reaction. In an endogonic reaction, energy has to be applied to the system in order to have the system going. So here in this graph, this is talking about a progress of a reaction. So in chemistry, you would have studied how the reactants will react. And then by either making bonds or breaking bonds, it will make a product. So this is the graph that shows it. But you can see the reactants need energy before it becomes a product. So the energy that has to be applied to a system is called as activation energy. So here in an exergonic reaction, Gibbs free energy is greater than 0. So that's why reaction is spontaneous. So no energy is required here, because the reactants have more energy than the products. Whereas in an endogonic reaction, the Gibbs free energy is less than 0. So you have to add energy to the system. This is not a spontaneous reaction. And for any reaction to proceed, many a time you need energy, which is called activation energy. See, from here, it has to go up here before the products are made. So now in biology, in order to reduce the activation energy and in order to have the chemical reactions going, we have something called enzymes. So enzymes are usually proteins, and how they work is that they work by reducing the activation energy. So here there's this energy barrier before the reactant becomes a product. So if there's an enzyme that is present, the activation barrier is reduced. So it's making the reaction possible. We have like hundreds of enzymes in our body making all these reactions possible. So here is a picture of an enzyme catalyzed reaction. The reactants in an enzyme catalyzed reaction is called substrate. So the substrate will sit in a special spot on the protein. It is called active site. And this is where the magic happens. It's a sweet spot where bonds are made, bonds are broken. So when the substrate sits in the active site, it's like a lock and key mechanism. It is very, very specific. And it requires specific conditions like specific temperature, pH, alkalinity, and so forth. So when the enzyme sits, it will change the shape slightly. So it's called induced fit. And then this is a transition state. There's a transitionary period where bonds are made or broken, and then the products will be made. So this is an example of an enzyme catalyzed chemical reaction in our body. So what are enzymes? Enzymes are proteins that speed up a reaction. They are not used up in a reaction, so they are reused again and again. The part of the enzyme where the substrate will come and anchor is called active site. The reactants are called substrate in an enzyme catalyzed reaction. Because the fit is so specific and it kind of molds around each other like a puzzle piece, it's called as an induced fit model. And enzymes are very, very specific. For example, sucrase will work on only sucrose. Lactase will work only on lactose. And also enzymes will end with the 3 alphabets, A, S, E. So how are enzymes regulated? So enzyme regulation. So here's the enzyme, and then here's the active site where the substrate will come and sit. But if a molecule is going to mimic the shape of the active site, mimic the substrate, and then it will go sit there, the substrate can't come sit. So it is competing for the active site. So that is called competitive inhibition. Because the enzyme is unable to adhere, do the induced fit with the substrate, because there's a foreign object now. It's competing for the active site. If the inhibitor molecule sits on a different site in the enzyme, not on the active site, it is called non-competitive inhibition. And so when I say it sits on a different site other than the active site, they'll call that site as an allosteric site. So allosteric inhibition is a type of non-competitive inhibition. So what happens is when a molecule sits on the allosteric site, it will change the shape of the active site so that now the substrate cannot come and anchor in the active site. So these are ways how enzymes are regulated in our body. But many a way in a metabolic reaction, right? That means there'll be a series of reaction. See, like product 1, enzyme 1 will act on it, and then it will become an intermediate, and then enzyme 2 acts on it, and then it becomes another intermediate, enzyme 3 acts on it. So in biology that you'll see a series of chemical reactions happening in order to come to the product. So many a time, in order to regulate, you don't need too much of the product. In order to regulate production of the product, the end product will act as an inhibitor, of an enzyme that acts in the beginning of the product. So this is called feedback inhibition, where the end product of the pathway will inhibit an upstream process. So this is a very important regulatory mechanism. This is how our body regulates the overproduction of end products. So we'll talk about how energy is made in a cell. So you have to be confident with the structure of ATP molecule, adenosine triphosphate. So that's the energy currency in a molecule. So it has a double ring structure called adenine. And then it has a 5-carbon ribose sugar, and then 3 phosphate groups, alpha, beta, and gamma. So every time it loses a phosphate group, it will release some energy. And this energy will be coupled with other reactions in order to provide the energy for the reaction. And energy is constantly needed by our body. ATP is always needed by our body. For example, for unicellular organisms, for movement. So this is like a flagella in a protist called Chlamydomonas. So for movement, when we are moving substances across the cell membrane against a gradient, then we use energy. We saw this last class in our sodium potassium pump. And then for many enzymatic reactions, you also need energy. So where does ATP come from? ATP comes from ADP. So in order to make ATP, your body will take ADP and add a phosphate to it. So we'll talk about how our body makes ATP. And we also studied that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell where our body makes ATP. So requires oxygen. That's why you and I are breathing. We need oxygen, the electron acceptor. Because there's so much energy in food, it happens in several steps. So the overall equation is the glucose or the food that you eat will be broken down to glucose molecules, C6H12O6. This is a redox reaction. That means a reduction oxidation reaction. So in the presence of oxygen, it will be reduced to form water and carbon dioxide, and ATP energy is given off as a byproduct. Also heat is given off. So there are 3 steps in aerobic cellular respiration. The first step, called glycolysis, happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. This does not require oxygen. Second step happens in the mitochondrial matrix. It is called citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle. The third step is called electron transport chain. It happens in the inner mitochondrial membrane. So mitochondria has this very unique structure. It has a double membrane. The outer membrane is smooth. The inner membrane is thrown into folds called cristae. And there is the intermembrane space happening here. So the overall reaction is broken down into 3 steps because there's so much energy in glucose. And it is released a little by little. You chip away the glucose molecule little by little so that energy is released in small quantities. You don't need a combustion inside every cell because there's too much energy in glucose. So let's look at the first one, glycolysis. See, it is a complicated process with like 8 steps and 8 enzymes involved in it. So here is a 6-carbon glucose. So that will be broken down into 2 3-carbon molecule called pyruvate here. This whole reaction happens in the cytoplasm. This is anaerobic. So this can proceed to without oxygen. But even though only 2 molecules of ATP is made overall, it is going to make an electron carrier called NADH. Nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. So these are going to grab the extra electrons and they will take it. They will shuttle those electrons to the electron transport chain. So only 2 ATPs made overall. Very small amount, but it's very quick and it's anaerobic. Anaerobic. Second step is called citric acid cycle. So this is a series of chemical reactions and it's a cycle that goes round and round. So they all happen in the mitochondrial matrix. So the pyruvate from glycolysis is a 3-carbon compound. It will break down into a 2-carbon compound called acetyl-CoA. See, there's only 2 carbons here. Now this is small enough to enter the mitochondrial matrix in order to participate in the citric acid cycle. The first chemical here would be isocitrate. That's why it's called citric acid cycle. But when pyruvate becomes acetyl-CoA, it will release carbon dioxide. And more carbon dioxide is released in the citric acid cycle also. So the carbon dioxide that you are exhaling right now is coming from here, the citric acid cycle and this transition step. Again, citric acid cycle makes only 2 ATPs, but it is going to make an electron carrier called NADH and FADH2. So these 2 are electron carriers. The third step is amazing. It's like mind-blowing to think that this is happening in our cells. So the electron transport chain. So this is a series of proteins that are found in the inner mitochondrial membrane. So all these blue structures you're seeing are proteins. So NAD and FAD are going to come and drop off their electrons here. So electrons are going to be shuttled from one protein to the other. So it's like a conveyor belt of electrons. So as NAD and FAD drop off the electrons are going to move through the chain. Here, the electron transport chain. And when this happens, the proton concentration, see, these all are acting like pumps. They're pumping out the proton in the inner mitochondrial space. So the proton, H plus concentration increases here. So now a gradient has formed. So this hydrogen will flow back through a protein called ATP synthase. And then it is also called as a molecular motor. So when this flows back, it will convert ADP to ATP. And this is where most of the ATP in our body is made. When that is happening, hydrogen will combine to produce water. Water is a byproduct. So ATP synthase is a protein complex. It's also called as a molecular motor. So when the hydrogen flows through it, it makes ATP. And it's like osmosis, right? High concentration to low concentration via a selectively permeable membrane. But here we are talking about chemicals. So it's called chemiosmosis. So this can make up to 32 molecules of ATP. Glycolysis only made 2. Citric acid cycle only made 2. Whereas here, most of the ATP is made. So it doesn't matter what food that you eat, like carbohydrate or lipids or proteins, they can enter the citric acid cycle in different parts of the cycle. For example, carbohydrates and amino acids and glycerol will enter the glycolysis step. Fatty acids will enter the pyruvate oxidation step. Amino acids can enter in the citric acid cycle step. So this is how our body can metabolize energy from different sources of organic molecules. And then on days when you don't have enough food in your stomach, it will start to attack the glycogen reserves in your muscles and liver, and then your body will make ATP. So this is the process by which cells make energy.